All right, strap in, everyone. We're
Yeah.
diving into a topic that everyone's talking about, woke culture. And you guys, our listeners, have sent us a ton of material.
Yeah, documentaries, interviews, some philosophy.
We got it all. And it's obvious this isn't just a passing fad. It's sparked, like, a full-blown cultural war.
Right, and everyone seems to have a strong opinion about what woke even is.
Yeah, and that's exactly why we're here, to try and unpack all of it. We're going to explore how this whole thing even started, how it's changed, and what kind of impact it's having on everything, from our daily lives to businesses, even the military. Get ready for some wild viewpoints along the way.
You know, it's really interesting how this whole debate links back to some really old philosophical questions about truth and reality. We'll definitely get into that later.
Oh, I can't wait for that. But first, rewind. Where did this woke thing even come from? You sent over that interview with Konstantin Kizin. He calls himself the anti-woke expert, right?
Yeah, he does. Kisin's a good place to start. He points out that wokeness actually started as a term used in Black communities. It was about being aware of social injustice, specifically the ones tied to racism, like opening your eyes to problems many people don't see.
So it started as a good thing.
Exactly. Empowerment, raising awareness. But like Kisin says, the term has changed, become something way more divisive.
How so?
Well, it's often seen as this attack on Western values, even a form of, as he says, social justice bullying.
Wow. And that shift is super clear in that woke phenomenon documentary. You see how the word woke went from 1930s Black American slang to this rallying cry for Black Lives Matter, and then to what it is today. It's kind of crazy.
It really is. And then we've got Thomas Sowell, the economist. In that Origins of Woke video, he says some leaders actually benefit from keeping their people dependent and scared.
Huh. Interesting. So you're saying maybe that's why some people feel like they're being manipulated by these social justice narratives, like there's a fear element being used?
It's a thought-provoking connection. Sowell's argument makes you think about the motivations behind any ideology that, needs to highlight suffering and victimhood to thrive.
Right. And it kind of reminds me of the Overton window, that concept from the Nerd Wars documentary. There's this range of opinions society accepts, but that range can shift over time.
Totally. And what's wild about wokeness is how fast that window has shifted. Topics that were once fringe ideas are now mainstream, and stuff that everyone used to agree on is now considered problematic.
Yeah. It's like the rules changed overnight. No wonder people feel so lost, or even like they can't speak up.
Definitely.
Okay, so we've got a basic understanding of how wokeness started and how the definition is changing. Now let's talk about the real world stuff. What kind of impact is this having on society? Kizin talks about this victimhood culture, right?
Yeah.
Where people focus on being offended or marginalized. And he actually suggests that that can be self-destructive.
Yeah, he does. He uses the study about scarring to make his point. People in the study were made to believe they had facial disfigurements.
Wait, really?
Yep. And even after they knew it was fake, they still felt treated differently.
So their perception became reality.
It did. And Kizin argues the same thing can happen with social justice. If you constantly see yourself as a victim, you might start seeing the world through that lens, even if it's not accurate.
That's kind of scary. It reminds me of the stereotype thread. Kizin talked about that too.
Right. That's the idea that when people are reminded of negative stereotypes about their group, they actually do worse at things related to those stereotypes. It's like if you tell someone they're bad at math, they might bomb the test, even if they're usually good at math.
Wow. That's crazy. And Kizin thinks this relates to the concerns in the Woke Warfare documentary about DEI initiatives in the military.
Mm-hmm.
Could focusing on things like white rage actually backfire and mess up unit performance?
That's the worry. The documentary gives specific examples, like renaming military bases or using a transgender drag queen for recruitment. They say it's like putting woke ideology ahead of actual military readiness.
But there is another side to this, right? The documentary also talks about how these DEI efforts are seen as necessary to make the military more inclusive.
Exactly. And that struggle, between promoting diversity and keeping things effective is a big part of these wokeness debates.
Definitely. And we also can't ignore cancel culture. The Woke Phenomenon documentary really goes into it. It shows this kind of dark side of online shaming and the pressure to conform. Remember the whole black square thing on Instagram?
Oh, yeah. The documentary shows how being afraid of being canceled stops people from having honest conversations, makes them too scared to say what they think.
It makes sense. And it's not just people feeling this pressure. That Sky News Australia piece on Go Woke, Go Broke shows how companies like Bud Light and Target, they faced huge backlash for their woke marketing.
Right. And it raises the question, are these companies really about social justice, or are they just doing it to look good to a certain audience?
Exactly. And then there's Unwoke Inc. It comes at it from a totally different angle.
Right. That documentary argues that there's a whole bunch of consumers who are turned off by all the woke stuff from corporations.
So there's a market for the opposite.
Yeah. And they show people like Amanda Ensing, who are building successful businesses by catering to this unwoke market.
So it's not as simple as saying every business should go woke. Some are losing money. Others are doing great by doing the opposite.
Exactly. The economic impact of wokeness is complicated. There's a real market for stuff that aligns with, let's say, more traditional values, and businesses are picking up on that.
It seems like wokeness is this double-edged sword. You've got companies getting slammed for being too woke, but then there's the argument that woke consumers are this huge economic opportunity.
Exactly. And it kind of reflects the whole wokeness debate. Is it about a positive change? Or like Sal says, is it about control? Is it about real inclusion? Or is bullying disguised as virtue, like Kissen says?
Man, those are some big questions.
Oh.
And people are clearly passionate on both sides.
For sure.
So what does all this mean for our listeners? How do you navigate this world where everyone seems to be picking sides?
That is the question, isn't it? We can't give you simple answers, but we can say you got to critically evaluate everything you see and hear, look at things from different angles, and most importantly, think for yourself.
Don't just go along with whatever everyone else is saying. Dig deeper. Ask questions.
Exactly. And don't forget, we're just getting started. We still need to talk about how wokeness is impacting entertainment, and then there's that philosophical connection we talked about.
Oh, yeah, can't wait. This deep dive is just heating up. Okay, so let's shift gears a bit. Let's talk about Hollywood. The entertainment industry has become like this battleground for the whole woke thing.
Oh, absolutely. Woke Hollywood. It's practically a meme now. And the Woke Hollywood Lost documentary, it actually argues that this whole push for woke stories, it might be hurting them.
Really?
Yeah. They say that focusing on identity politics and all that, it's turned off a big part of the audience. Like less people are watching, movies are flopping.
Interesting. So less people are going to movies because they're too woke.
That's what they're saying. They point to stuff like the all-female Ghostbusters. You know, the one that got so much hate. And how the Empire in Star Wars is basically portrayed as, like, white supremacists.
Ah, okay. So they're saying forcing these woke messages into these big franchises actually makes the stories worse. And that's why people aren't watching.
That's the argument, yeah. It feels forced and fake, like they're not being genuine.
Right, right. But we can't forget that there are tons of people who actually love seeing more diversity and representation in movies and TV. They say it's super important for social progress, so everyone feels seen, you know?
Of course, yeah. And that just shows how complicated this all is. It's about finding that sweet spot, you know, where you can have diversity and still tell a good story.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, so you mentioned this philosophical connection earlier. What does wokeness have to do with, like, Nietzsche and the death of God?
All right, so the Woke Phenomenon documentary makes this really cool connection. They say that as traditional values and religion decline, like what Nietzsche called the death of God, it creates a void, like something's missing.
Okay, I'm following. So if people aren't basing their morals on religion anymore, what takes its place?
That's the big question, right? And the documentary argues that when those old sources of authority fade away, you get these new moral frameworks popping up. And they often clash.
So wokeness, with all its focus on social justice and identity, that could be seen as one of those new frameworks trying to fill the void.
Exactly. It's a way for people to figure out what's right and wrong, you know, to find a purpose and connect with other people who think the same way.
I see. Which might explain why people get so fired up about these woke issues.
Yeah, for sure. And this all links back to the idea of correct language, which we talked about before. If there's no longer one agreed upon set of morals, then the words we use for these issues, they become supercharged.
Because every word, every label is tied to these different ways of seeing the world.
Right. That's why it feels like you can't even talk about wokeness without it turning into an argument. It's not just about words. It's about totally different ways of looking at the world and morality.
Man, that's deep. Okay, so we've covered how wokeness started, its impact on things like society, business, the military, and now even entertainment.
And we've touched on how it all links to these big philosophical questions about truth, morals, and what happens to values when religion might be losing its hold.
It's a lot to think about. So before we wrap up, what really stood out to you from all of this?
You know, what I keep coming back to is this tension between individual responsibility and the systems we all live in.
Like the whole nature versus nurture thing.
Exactly. You have Kissen and Sewell, who are all about personal choice and taking responsibility for your life. Don't get stuck in the victim mindset, they say.
Like the pull yourself up by your bootstraps idea.
Right. But then you have the other side, which says, hold on, there are these huge inequalities in the system. Like, no matter how hard you try, some people just have it harder.
Like the argument about white privilege, how some people just start with an advantage.
Exactly. And this tension, it's at the heart of so much of this woke debate. How much of what happens to us is because of our choices? And how much is the system? Where does personal responsibility end, and where does society have to step in?
That's a tough one. I don't think there's an easy answer.
No, there isn't. It's about both. Our choices and the system. And to really get it, you have to think carefully and be open to different viewpoints.
And that's what this deep dive is all about, right?
You got it. We're bombarded with info and different stories all the time. Now more than ever, we need to learn how to think for ourselves.
I totally agree. Okay, so we've gone through the origins of wokeness, how it affects different parts of society, and even touched on some pretty heavy philosophy. But I guess we still haven't answered the big question. Is woke culture good or bad?
And maybe that's the biggest takeaway. There's no simple answer. Like most things in culture, wokeness has good and bad sides. It can highlight real problems and inspire change. But it can also divide people, shut down conversations, and make people scared to say what they think.
So what's our next move? We've given our listeners a lot to think about, but what now?
Well, I think it's important to not get stuck in this black and white thinking. The world isn't just woke versus unwoke. Trying to simplify things like that just keeps us from understanding each other.
Right. It's not about picking a side. It's about engaging with the ideas, looking at the nuances, and forming your own opinions.
And remember, this deep dive is just the beginning. Keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep challenging what you think you know.
Because to understand this woke thing, which is always changing, you have to keep learning and be open to different perspectives. It's like we're back where we started, trying to figure out what personal responsibility even means in a world where everyone's got an ideology and the rules keep changing.
Yeah, it can feel impossible sometimes. Like you get caught up in the outrage, the fear, all the pressure to just fit in.
It's easy to feel like everyone's telling you how to think, what to say, even how to feel. Right.
Exactly. So how do you stay true to yourself in all of that?
That's the big question.
Well, you got to stay informed about what's going on, have those tough conversations, but you also got to develop your own critical thinking skills, your own moral compass.
So we shouldn't just blindly follow the crowd. Don't just accept any label or ideology without thinking about it.
Exactly. Question the narratives, look at the evidence, and most importantly, think for yourself.
Easier said than done, right?
It is.
Yeah.
It takes courage to stand up for what you believe in, especially when it's not popular. And it takes even more courage to actually talk to people who disagree with you. And do it respectfully.
You're so right. Being willing to listen, to learn, and to question your own beliefs, even when it's hard.
That's how we grow, both as individuals and as a society.
Well, it looks like we've reached the end of our deep dive into woke culture. What a ride.
It's a complex topic for sure, and we've only just scratched the surface.
But hopefully this has given our listeners a better grasp of where woke culture came from, how it's changed, and all the different opinions about it.
And most importantly, we hope it encourages everyone to keep learning about this, to keep the conversation going, and to form their own opinions.
Because it's so easy to get lost in all the noise and outrage, We need critical thinking, courage, and open minds more than ever.
Couldn't agree more. So keep those questions coming, keep learning, and keep diving deep.
Until next time, everyone.